everybody. We are back. Hope you had a little time to recharge there for 5 minutes. Okay, so if you're following along in the participant workbook, we are on page 26 and 27 now. And I'm really excited about this next session. I feel like we get a sneak peek into the latest research. So we've got some researchers that are going to share with you some recent findings that are paving the road to greater knowledge and understanding of how tribes are affected by climate change and climate impacts and how they are also addressing them. So get a little window also into strategies. We're going to start first. I'm really excited about this panel. I'm going to introduce all of them. Just a second. There we go. So Dr. Carlotta Chief is the professor and extension specialist in environmental science at the University of Arizona. As the director of Indigenous Resilience Centers, she aims to facilitate efforts at the University of Washington's climate and environment researchers, faculty, staff, and students working with Native Americans to build resiliency to climate impacts and environmental challenges. So she is a real rock star in this field. Also, Kyle White, Dr. Kyle White, he is George Willis Pack Professor at the School for Environment and Sustainability, teaching at the SEAS Environmental Justice Specialization. He's an affiliate professor of Native American Studies and Philosophy, and his research addresses environmental justice, focusing on moral and political issues concerning climate policy and Indigenous peoples, the ethics of cooperative relationships between Indigenous peoples and science organizations, and other related issues. And then first up is actually going to be Ben Hatchett. He's an assistant research professor and research climatologist at the Western Regional Climate Center. And he aims to utilize collaborative transdisciplinary approaches to provide actionable science and data accessibility in support of building community-level resilience to extreme weather and climate events in dry land and mountain environments. So Ben is going to be up first, and he's one of our partners. He works with us pretty closely, more recently too, and he's a wealth of knowledge. So thanks for being here, Ben. I'm going to leave it to you.
Awesome. Well, thank you very much. And I'm really honored and grateful to be included in this discussion and to share what I've been learning and hopefully motivate some other fun work that we can do together, fun and valuable work to improve our collective community resilience, or maybe I shouldn't use that word after yesterday's discussion, improve our adaptive capacity to handle the expected and unexpected. I think that's another useful way to kind of address some of these challenges that were mentioned in the previous session of we're not particularly well adapted to the climate that we have, and that brings up challenges going forward. But the better we can move towards adapting to challenges historically, the better we'll be going forwards. So I'll talk a bit about kind of where some of this actionable climate research is headed. And I want to start by sharing what I thought was a really fantastic artist rendition of a session that was given, I believe, a year or two ago as part of Cali, PA, that I was fortunate to be involved with, that really pictorially represents many aspects of California's changing climate and many other places as well. I'll be a little bit California and Western US centric, but bear in mind that many of these methods and approaches are globally applicable. One thing that I think everyone's very well aware of is rare events are becoming commonplace. Yesterday, we talked a lot about everyone's experiencing these things. 20, 50 years ago, it might have been a handful of people experiencing this, but now we all are. And so rare events are becoming commonplace. And as we talk about weather and climate extremes, it's really important to think about the timescales at which they're taking place, the physical processes that are occurring, and the spatial scales at which those processes take place at, and the timescales at which they do, because those are all key parts of trying to evaluate our set of tools to identify how much more frequent and of what magnitude these things are expected to change. So we're in a kind of a unique time with concurrent or compound events that are taking place with multiple processes impacting us at the same time, and often things that happen days, weeks, months, or years after individual events. And I think the wildfire situation is a perfect example of that. So one of our main goals, or at least I guess, collectively thinking about the higher order we, as a climate scientist, one of I and our main goals is to provide this locally relevant information at appropriate timescales for examining impacts. And I think a good way to think about that, and this picture really shows that, is there's a lot of processes taking place, and they can happen at the house-to-house scale. Whether you have air conditioning or not is going to make a big difference in terms of how your how that heat wave will affect you, and indoor air quality will take place. But then things are happening at much larger scales, like drought, for example. But even drought can take place differently depending on which watershed you're in, whether or not you have access to water from groundwater or bringing it in a different way. And so looking at the landscape, we can see many different scales and processes. In the upper left there, that's a Walker Lake in Western Nevada. And we can look at the changing lake levels as a result of longer time scale drought, but then also singular wet events. Big years or even big storms can produce rises in the lake. Changing the flow in the rivers. We have trees in the Walker River that indicate years of persistent and extreme drought. And many indicators across the landscape help us understand these past types of climate impacts. And I've been fortunate to learn a lot from the Paiute tribe and some of their stories about their ancestors walking along the ice that deposited these boulders in the upper right, and how they headed along the ice, and eventually the ice retreated, and it continues to retreat today. But occasionally we have big wet years, and we get more snow in the mountains, and return the lakes and all of the ecosystems that this supports. But now we're faced with things like this. This is the Caldor fire that occurred last year that produced a lot of negative impacts locally in the California and Lake Tahoe basin, but then downstream all the way into the Midwestern part of the United States with poor air quality. And I think one important thing shown in this image is there's a lot going on here, and the tools that we have right now, Earth system models to project climate change, there's about 25 or even more of these types of pictures in one grid cell. So for one value of temperature, one value of air quality, one value of precipitation, one value of runoff, one value of burned area or a fraction of burned area. And so it's very difficult to resolve because we have these processes taking place at these various scales. But our projections are getting higher resolution in both space and time, allowing our a more nuanced view to be taken of specific impacts, particularly things of interest to all of us like snowpack loss or wildfire, temperature extremes. That's the image shown on the right, where we can look at specific thresholds of interest. 95 degrees Fahrenheit is where avocado trees really start to change their ecophysiological processes. We can use many different climate models to get a better estimate of the uncertainty. The figure on the furthest right there shows the range of temperatures for different places predicted for the future. So you can kind of start to look at what's the average, what's the worst case, what's the best case scenario. Same thing for hydrologic hazards and air quality. And so as we think about all of these processes, I think this is a nice figure to really show those scales going downwards from kind of the broad scales where we have a generally good understanding and good capabilities for prediction and projection. But then as we get more detailed at increasingly local scales, that's really where a lot of the challenges are coming out and where we have a lot of work to do to improve that. But we're getting a lot better. And as part of that, that's really where that'll start influencing some of these factors on the right-hand side, how water or land is managed at various scales, how water is moved, what kinds of infrastructure is needed or is struggling, what kinds of monitoring we have to understand these changes and individual situations during extreme events, and how we can better take advantage of resources that we have to get us through times of extended drought. Improving resolution in models is something you may hear a lot about in climate science, and that's really our capability to see features, to zoom in and really get a better idea of features of interest like atmospheric rivers and how those will affect different places differently. Chile is a prime example, very, very long, narrow place. Some places may get a lot of precipitation, some areas may get very little. And as we increase our ability to run these models, we can use what's called more ensemble members. That means the model gets run more and more times to give us a little bit more confidence in the results. So one key finding from a lot of our recent work has really been on focused on snowpack decline and the impacts on water availability. And that paper that was referenced previously, and I'll send a link around in case you're unable to access it, summarized snowpack loss in the Western United States and found that by the end of the 21st century, we're expecting 30 to 80% losses of snow. And we're already starting to see that in a very extreme sense, but the concern is it will become more persistent and eventually consistent. Some recent work in the process of publishing now is highlighting how the precipitation and snowmelt that does occur is going to become less efficient. Less stream flow will be resulting, and that's largely because of a warming, drying, thirstier atmosphere. And so that means that even wet years are going to yield less water than in the past, bringing up these questions of how can we better maximize what water we do have when it is flooding? How can we store that water and keep it for use later on? And no matter what the climate does, this will benefit us because even in times of extreme aridity or wet years that then are followed by warm and dry spells, we'll have water to use for agriculture and potentially for drinking water as well. This warming is going to drive less seasonal snow. And as we've already started to see, these drier conditions are going to occur later in the year, and that's going to produce more wildfire. And so some work we're doing now is looking at changes in annual burned area in different once historically snowy places and looking at how fire will change in snowy places that once had seasonal long duration snowpacks that become ephemeral, where the snow melts, it goes away, you get a little bit more snow, it melts, and places where no changes are taking place, and notably places where the highest elevations where we did not used to have wildfire. Now we're starting to see that, and we expect to see large increases in burned area in these high elevations. And historically, we've always had fire in the higher elevations, and counting up how many detections from satellite across the state of California we've seen, the red and blues show that there's always been a little variability in that for the past 20 or so years, some years with more, some years with less. But look at the far right, and you'll see about a factor of 10 increase just in the past couple of years of fire activity in our highest, snowiest places. And that changes many parts of the hydrologic cycle and the ecosystem and negatively impacts our communities. And so the time is now to really think about this. And quoting Richard Feynman about the point of doing physics is to do more physics. Well, the point of doing climate science is to do more of it. And good research should open up more questions and really guide us towards better solutions, both in the short and immediate terms, as well as the long terms. Some areas that I think we have some important research needs going forward are really about bringing good fire back onto the land. Cultural and prescribed fire, I think, is one tremendous opportunity to improve our landscapes and our community safety to fire, as well as the health of these environments. Community engaged research, making research relevant and actionable is key, and better understanding how extreme events are changing our behavior and getting down to these locally relevant scales of impact. So some of this, and I've got a bunch here that you can look at later. I'll just really quickly run through. Community engaged research is really helping understand what the community needs to better communicate information as we move from scientific graphics towards things that the broad community can understand. How can we make that more effective? What words should we use? What language should we use? What kinds of graphics are helpful in doing so? Writing reports in languages of specific relevance can be beneficial. This is an example of a report we did in English and then had it translated into Spanish to approach more people and make it more understandable for a broader audience. And so that more people can get this information communicated to them. Thinking about extreme events, we've done a little bit of work finding that extreme events like wildfire, hurricanes, cold spells, it changes how we move and behave. And sometimes that's good, sometimes it's bad. It's a good thing if you're taking protective action. It's a bad thing if you're stuck inside in an indoor heat wave with poor air quality and everyone's sick. And we need to keep doing this work to better understand how heat waves and flood events have these impacts. So when the world kind of looks like Stranger Things is upon us, indeed it is. And so with the time to really think about and move forward with this is right now. Thing I'm going to close out with here is this idea of returning good fire to the land, bringing fire back onto these landscapes where cultural fire has been suppressed and removed for centuries now by Western colonialization, starting with the Spanish in the western part of the United States in particular. And our landscapes have co-evolved with cultural fire to become fire adapted, if not fire dependent. And so restoring this cultural tradition, I think, is a really, really spectacular opportunity to get the youth involved, to get the community together, to improve the lands and bring them back to a healthy state. And an important study just came out from the American Lung Association showing smoke impacts from prescribed fire are actually there's still some, but they're much less than severe wildfire. So that kind of says, even though people might complain about a little bit of smoke, it's much better than having these extreme, severe, persistent wildfires all year long. So how to get involved? Engage the youth, encourage them to see the situation as an opportunity to make positive change and build community capabilities and team up with all age ranges. A lot of researchers want to help, but we don't know how sometimes. So this is a great experience for me. And as has been noted, it's tough to find those who are willing to sit, listen, be quiet, observe. We're taught to want to tell you, but we need to listen to you. So invite people to test waters and see who you work well with, who you don't. Bring people together after experiences, following events. In wildfire, we call this the after action review to understand what worked, what didn't, how can we prepare better? And so one nice example of that is done through this process of fire, and that can be extended to many aspects of the community. So with that, I'll end there and thank you again for having me.
Thanks so much, Ben. I could listen to you all day, and keep your fingers crossed, everybody. Hopefully we get this next grant we wrote, because Ben could help us a lot more on what's happening in the water supply area. All right, with that, we're going to move on to our next speaker. And I want to remind the audience, please do drop questions in the chat. We'll have a little time for Q&A at the end. So thank you so much for being with us, Dr. Chief. And we will drive slides for you, so don't worry.
All right, good morning. Today I'm going to talk about climate change impacts that are impacting tribal water resources and about Indigenous Resilience Center. Ano po siya Portraining do ko hana bashin aro zasanay dashi do ye idene kachini dashinala akota esamenchle. I am from the Bitterwater clan, born for near the Water clan, and hello to all my relatives out there. Thank you for having me here at this virtual conference. Next. Climate change is going to impact both tribes and non-tribal citizens. However, for tribes, they will have a unique impact. But to Native Americans, water is sacred and it is tradition. And this is different from other individuals that see water as just to use it. But for Native Americans, they revere water, and water is life. And as I shared with you, my clans, three of my clans are water-based. And so it's even part of our identity. It's part of our blessings, our ceremonies. And we see water holistically, not just as a single entity that connects all. It's part of our worldviews and part of our spiritual beliefs. Like for me as a Dene individual, we see water as female rain and male rain. And male rain is the thunderstorms, and the female rains are the gentle winter rains. And together they come to unite on the mountains, and that's where life starts, and it gives life to everything. So to us, that has its own song, its own spirit, and its own life, and that's part of the Navajo worldview. So like other tribes as well, they also have that similar view of water as sacred. Next. And so these unique impacts to tribes are not only going to impact the climate, as the previous speaker spoke about, but also that those will have cascading impacts to other things that Native Americans are really dependent on, such as the changes in the shifts for different types of species that we rely on, like animals that are hunted or plants that are gathered for cultural and medicinal purposes. And then it also creates hazards for tribes that have to go across to gather and hunt. And we talked a lot about those different impacts yesterday in our breakout sessions. Next. So how do we think about these impacts? Well, there's so many tribes across the United States that they that it's really hard to really provide a framework. But in this talk, I'm going to try to explain one framework that our team had done many, many years ago. Next. So the vulnerability to climate change was examined through a hazard and disaster risk reduction framework that was set in a medicine wheel. And that was because we wanted to emphasize the interconnectedness of factors that constrain or enable tribal nations to respond to these hazards. And so there are 5 listed here, and these 5 are socioeconomic, political, infrastructure, ecosystem services and land use, and spirituality and culture. So when you're doing your vulnerability assessment and your adaptation plan, this is one way to kind of think about what areas you're going to look at when you're writing your plan or your assessment. So next, please. So first is a socioeconomic factor, and both tribes are small, and that they are in rural areas, and so their structure, community structure, is going to determine how they respond to climate hazards and also how they are impacted. And so because of the lack of strong economic support, there may be impacts that are not cost feasible or that have such a bigger impact. For example, one is water transport. It costs a lot to build pipelines to deliver water, and so the cost per person to deliver water is much higher than some in an urban setting. And the economic impacts, the economic factors like unemployment rate, household income, those are important to consider because that relates to the ability of the tribe to manage their water resources. Next one is political factors. Tribes are sovereign nations, and there are different types of tribes: federally recognized, state recognized, and unrecognized tribes. And they, within their own sovereign nation, can be able to have different ways to govern themselves. So some examples to consider are that some tribes have off-reservation rights for hunting, for their subsistence, and so they don't necessarily stay within their defined territories, but that they can also have other types of rights. Federally recognized tribes have water rights. Either if they're defined or not defined, they often have senior priority to those rights. And at the same time, tribes also are impacted by off-reservation pollution. And even though they're within a watershed, they can be left out of those conversations related to the management of water in the watershed. So these are all political factors that need to be considered when you're thinking about vulnerability, because they're very complex and they need to be considered in that assessment. Next. The third one is infrastructure. And so yesterday we were talking about that in the built environment section, about how, with changing water quality, that water quality may not be able to be treated with the current water infrastructure that the tribe has. And so that's a vulnerability that needs to be considered, because the water quality will change, the quantity of water and the timing of water will change. And if they're not addressed, that can result in health consequences. And so they can lead to other cascading impacts. So that's the vulnerability. So those impacts can quickly drain tribal finances. But even before climate change, tribes had already faced these challenges, and climate change is definitely amplifying it more, particularly through the pandemic. Those vulnerabilities were even more amplified. Next. So the fourth factor is the ecosystem services. And because climate change can lead to ecosystem changes, climate change can impact the ecosystem services that tribes are dependent on, like subsistence and cultural activities, such as fishing, ranching, and gathering of medicinal and herbal plants. So that needs to be considered in the assessment. And then also another ecosystem service is groundwater. Groundwater supplies 93% of Native American waters, and many of which support drinking water systems. So, combined with the economic, political factors that also are stressing the ecosystems that the tribes depend on. Next. Finally is probably the most important one too, is spiritual and cultural factors. And Native Americans are connected to these places from which they come from. Their culture and their spirituality are all embedded in that. In addition, they have complex knowledge of their place that has been passed down through generations that are important for understanding the impacts and to be more resilient. And so Deb Holland released a memo about how traditional knowledges need to be considered in federal decision making. So that's really great to see. And actually, Kyle White and I were part of a group that developed guidelines to protecting traditional knowledges in climate adaptation planning. So that's a useful guide, especially now with more of that being supported at the federal level. So this knowledge can be important to extending environmental records where that data may not be available. Next. So in the Southwest, where I am and where we are, there are 170 tribes, and they range from small to large, urban and rural. There's so many diverse ecosystems, but climate change is impacting all the different industries that tribes rely on, and often pushing them to marginal resources. Most of these tribes have been experiencing drought for decades, and for example, sand dunes of the Navajo Nation, wildfires with the White Mountain Apache tribe, drought and loss of livestock with the wildfire, flooding. We talked about flooding yesterday. That's impacting Havasupai. So these are all impacting tribes and creating needed action to ensure that tribes are resilient to that. Next, so during the pandemic, we saw that a lot of these vulnerabilities were amplified. And for example, I work on the Navajo Nation, where we do work on the food, energy, water systems, where food access, water security, and energy security are lacking. And so at the University of Arizona, next, we developed a training program to train our students on how to work with Indigenous communities. Next.
Dr. Chief, sorry, just a 2-minute warning, thanks.
Okay. And we are training students to learn how to work with Indigenous communities within these food, energy, water nexus. And that includes immersion in the communities, ethics, and to have cultural training in those. Next. So one way to build resilience is to develop off-grid food, energy, water systems that are sustainable and interconnected, where rural residents can be able to have food, energy, water security. Next. And the only way we can do this is to do it with the invitation of the tribe, which we were invited by the Navajo Water Access Coordination Group to help address these challenges of food, energy, water during the pandemic. Next. And so we downsized the off-grid mobile solar unit that I showed to you to be household level. Next. So it's important that we talk also about the vulnerability to understand how tribes can adapt, but also really think about how we can be more resilient. And the Indigenous resilience is, defined within the community and what they see. And I found one really nice definition of Indigenous resilience, which really connects the family, community, and tribal nation in all aspects of different resources that foster strength and well-being, and being more resilient to different types of perturbations like climate change. But that the tribe is supported in a way that they continue to have connection to their community, to their culture, their identities, and being able to thrive in today's dominant culture. Next. So many of the resilience frameworks that I see out there often fail to consider Indigenous perspectives, and even sometimes they do, but they still are within a colonial framework that fail to consider political, social, and cultural perspective. So this is a framework that I've modified from the work that we've done on tribal water impacts to climate change, that looks at how it builds upon the Australian Indigenous resilience, where we're looking at the resilience to household, community, and tribal nation within the food, energy, water nexus. Next. So I want to conclude and say thank you for having me here, and that tribes have a need to prepare and respond to climate change, and to do a way that is considering cultural and spiritual values, and that uncertainties may exist, but that that uncertainty has to be accounted for in the iterative nature of redesigning that climate adaptation plan, and that it only works if it's integrated to an existing plan. And this is so important for us, for Native nations, that they be included, because for too long they've been left out. And it's important that that process be participatory and transparent. I wanted to share that I'm looking for a postdoc to work with me on Indigenous STEM education. So if you know of anybody that's interested to do that work, please let me know. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Chief. We really appreciate you being here and spending the time talking about your research. And stick around because I'm sure people have questions for you. So our next speaker and our last speaker in this session is Dr. Kyle White. We so appreciate you being here with us as well. And we'll turn it over to you. You can drive your own slides as well.
Okay, thank you. Good to be with you all. And I don't have my own slides. I'm just going to go with the oral tradition for our conversation today. I wanted to talk about an overview of some of the key ways in which Indigenous health and climate change have been showing up in some of the major national and international science reports that play a big role in driving policy and funding for Indigenous health and climate change. And I first wanted to start off by making a few comments on the state of research on Indigenous peoples' health and climate change based on my own observations. You know, when I started off working in this area as a member of the Citizen Potawatomi Nation and an Anishinaabe person that lives in our homelands in the Great Lakes region, I started off doing climate change planning at the tribal level, you know, now well over 15 years ago. And so I worked with multiple tribes on their early climate change plans, on their climate change policies. And one of the approaches that is now a common approach for driving internal tribal research on health and climate change is to begin a unified tribal planning process based around tribes' traditions of having seasonal calendars. And so for Anishinaabe people, for example, in the Great Lakes, we have our seasonal round traditions. And these are traditions, right, where at every part during the year, when the environment changes, when the seasons change, there's certain social activities, ceremonial activities, family activities, economic activities, political activities. And each of those calendars describes the way in which seasons and other environmental changes affect people's health, whether it's in terms of food and nutrition, whether it's in terms of weather and shelter. And one of the ways that we first began to talk about health and climate change was as disruptions to those seasonal ways of life. And in two senses, both for communities that very much are living in that way, but also as a way of thinking for communities that may be living differently, that seasonal round way of thinking about things is a very interdisciplinary and integrated way to understand how your health is related to the environment around you. And so these approaches were very powerful ways to bring tribes together internally to learn about the ways that climate change was affecting their health. And with something like a seasonal calendar or a seasonal round, it really brings people together because oftentimes different tribal departments or elders or other programs have developed already versions of their calendars or seasonal rounds, but we would make it a community activity for multiple people to come together, tribal staff from different departments, youth organizations, elders councils, harvesting and subsistence groups, and others to create a process by which they would make a calendar tied to climate change, and it would engage people's languages, their cultures, but also their understanding of the key economic realities that they were facing and how those are affected by climate change. So going back a number of decades, this was an important strategy for how to begin internal tribal research on climate change and health. And this was primarily stemming from people that were already working in the environmental sector that were trying to get into health issues. I appreciated my colleague Dennis Longknife's comments earlier about that there's another way into this, and it's from the health research standpoint and then bringing climate change into that. And the work I do was coming from that first perspective, which was as a environmental and climate change researcher, beginning to understand how health was related to climate change in different ways. And I mentioned this background in tribal planning and research as a way to highlight that actually the best research studies on health and climate change are the ones that are performed directly by tribal staff and tribal communities. And they've actually had a huge impact. So for example, some of you are familiar with an example that's been very powerful, which is the range of publications and programs and work that have been done on health and climate change by colleagues at the Swinomish tribe. And again, this work also has these elements of a seasonal calendar and a community process for understanding the connections between health and climate change. And the studies that the staff and community of that tribe have produced have had a tremendous impact both on other tribes in terms of their health and climate change work, but also in the global scientific literature. So again, about 15 years, almost 2 decades ago, one of the things that I began to be more involved in was trying to provide Indigenous voice and Indigenous knowledge in some of the major scientific reports on climate change. One that everybody knows is the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. Another one more close to home, but that oftentimes less people know about, is the National Climate Assessment, which is kind of like the United States version of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. And so these are major scientific reports that don't really do original research, but they summarize all of the existing research, and then they package it in ways that policymakers, philanthropic funders, and others can digest so as to know what policies or funding programs they need to create to support key climate change related issues. Now, with regard to the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, they typically took a pretty hostile and arrogant position to Indigenous knowledge and didn't really include what we had to say or a body of knowledge for a long time since their inception. That recently has changed. And so, for example, I was a contributing author, and I see a couple of colleagues here like Melinda Chase that were also contributing authors on the most recent Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change report. And in the Working Group 2 report, which is a massive report, there was a North America section to that that includes a number of citations directly on the health impacts that Indigenous people are facing with respect to climate change. And Dr. Chief's presentation discussed a number of aspects of health impacts related to climate change that we took up in that section. And so I think it's important to know that the IPCC is now going to be a document moving forward that has substantive sections on health. But the point I want to make is that the literature review and summary that we did would not have been possible without the tribal publications on health, the tribally led documents and reports and publication on health and climate change. And this is, again, just to emphasize this point that really in this area of research, it's the work that tribes are doing that has really put on the map this key topic of health that a lot of non-Indigenous people didn't really understand at the depth that they needed to understand it, in terms of really taking very seriously that climate change affects multiple dimensions of Indigenous peoples and Indigenous communities' health. Now, the National Climate Assessment is a little bit different. It started 3 decades ago, and Native people have been involved in it since the 1990s. However, health was not a topic that resonated that much within the National Climate Assessment. But in the last 2 reports, the topic of health has been extremely prevalent, including there being about 4 or 5 years ago a report, not the National Climate Assessment itself, but the parent organization, which is called the US Global Change Research Program. They published a report on vulnerability that had a subsection that I led on the health impacts of climate change. And the last National Climate Assessment, and I'll send you some links in a second, has a specific chapter on Indigenous people tribes and Indigenous people. And there are a lot of health issues that are discussed in that chapter, health issues tied to a number of different facets of climate change. And there's a current National Climate Assessment that's ongoing that currently draft chapters, including a draft chapter of the Tribes and Climate Change chapter, which I'm the lead author on right now, is currently being reviewed by federal agencies. But expect that chapter to have substantive coverage and summary of health issues. And I mentioned these 2 reports, the National Climate Assessment and the IPCC, because again, they do show a trend that globally and nationally, people are taking health more seriously as one of the key issues affecting Native people, and that funders and governments need to take much more seriously. Another one I want to mention to you is a report that was sponsored by the Institute for Tribal Environmental Professionals and the Bureau of Indian Affairs. It's called the Status of Tribes and Climate Change Report. And a number of people I see here have been involved in that in different ways, including our colleague Shasta. And that report had, and it might have been discussed earlier in this conference, had, 33 testimonials and over 90 authors who are specialists in climate change issues. And if you do like a word search within it for health, you'll see a number of facets and narratives and stories about health aspects of climate change. And again, I'll provide the links when I'm done speaking. And so I'd suggest that people review that report. It's called the STAC report, but again, that stands for Status of Tribes and Climate Change Report. And it was peer reviewed, and it serves as a technical input. Oh, Shasta, I wanted to provide the link.
You know me, I can't keep my fingers out of the
chat. Okay, just kidding. Anyways, I'd encourage folks to see it. It does have some of the latest views and perspectives on health. But I'd also just say that the reports that I've discussed are certainly not the only games in town. For example, if you focus on particular regions like the Arctic, you'll find that people there have done substantive work on health, whether in peer-reviewed academic literature, reports from indigenous organizations or intertribal organizations. And so I think oftentimes it's important to look below the surface to see what people have been doing. Now, the last thing I want to talk about are some of the research trends that I think are critical. And so the first one is just a reiteration of something I said before, that I think it's important with a topic as intimate as health, that tribes feel empowered to be doing their own research and to be governing how they publish that research and how to make it public. So if you're doing an initiative on health and climate change and you're feeling comfortable making public some aspects of that, I'd really encourage you to do so. But again, not all initiatives, people might feel that they're in the position to make what they're doing public. I certainly know that the vast majority of climate change planning that I did with tribes, the recommendations and conclusions from those planning processes, those tribal councils, chose to keep those internal to tribes. But in a lot of cases, they were also published and have had a big impact. Another aspect is that we really need to keep working to transform how we understand the nature of health. I don't think that some of the common Western and American understandings of health map onto the different ways in which Native people, our communities, actually understand how our health relates to climate. So for example, I'm part of a project led by Dr. Angela Fernandez at the University of Wisconsin that's trying to review the literature that talks about relationality with the environment as a factor of health. Being outside, being connected to plants and animals, medicinals, and so on, but in a cultural way, in a social way, in a community way, is itself a health aspect, which means that climate change is going to have a very much a disruptive aspect on that. And so for this reason, areas like we were looking for literature in this topic and haven't found very much. There is literature out there, but again, it's an area of growing need, articulating indigenous conceptions of health and in a way that's very practical for our communities. And the Swinomish studies, for example, do an excellent job making this case, which is why they've had a lot of impact in some of the reports that I mentioned before. And lastly, I currently serve on the White House Environmental Justice Advisory Council and have been someone that's made a lot of recommendations and done a lot of advocacy for what's called the Justice 40 initiative, which is a major Biden-Harris administration initiative to ensure that across federal spending in a number of areas related to the environment, such as climate resilience, energy, water quality, but also the workforce development related to those areas, that 40% of the benefits of those investments go to communities that have been left out of all major US periods of infrastructure investment. And so obviously, thinking about Dr. Chief's presentation, that means a lot of indigenous people should benefit from the Justice 40 initiative. And what I want to say is that, and I know a colleague earlier had just said that they're going to present, over 100 or so programs that are related to empowering the type of climate change work that many of us really want to do. That a Justice 40 initiative is a key part of this. And one of the challenges that I've seen is that when people think about federal investments in these areas of infrastructure, they are not oftentimes having information available to them on the health implications of infrastructure investments as they relate to climate change. So for example, when I've served as an advisor for tribes that have been going through resettlement, climate change resettlement, a lot of the engineers and others that were working on those, they understood sort of some of the economic aspects of resettlement, but they had not seen literature, been exposed to literature about the health aspects of climate change related resettlement. And you see this in other areas as well, federal climate change plans or infrastructure strategies that again are only looked at in terms of certain economic and other facets, but the health narrative of those investments is not widely known. And so the more that we can create literature and create knowledge of how tribes actually understand the practical health implications of climate change initiatives, the more these periods of federal investment like the Justice 40 initiative will be able to furnish programs and guidance that tribes can actually take advantage of to be able to improve their health situation. So these are some of the things that I wanted to put on people's radar and mention in terms of some of my views on the trends. And I appreciate the chance to connect and to share with you all.
Thank you, Kyle. And sorry for stealing your thunder with the link to the stack report. But yeah, we have a few minutes left for Q&A. So I know we've had some people putting some great comments into the chat and talking about some of their experiences. But what I'd like to hear from our speakers for this session, it relates back to a question from the earlier session, which is, how do our trainees here, folks who are just starting this work for their tribal communities, how do they get started? What's your best piece of advice for moving forward with all of this information that we're providing and actually getting into the weeds? And I'll you know what, I'm gonna pick on Dr. Chief. I'm gonna pull female authority here. Dr.
Can we
Chief.
repeat that question?
Okay.
I'm sorry.
So yeah, what's your best piece of advice for our people who are starting this new?
So starting new and working with tribes on climate change, right?
Or within their tribes on this
Within
work,
their
and they're
tribes,
just
yeah.
starting.
Yeah, I would really recommend to seek the available resources that are out there. There's the Tribal Climate Toolkit that has links to several different tools, and then also get connected with the NAU Intertribal Environmental Professionals, where they do trainings all over the U.S. on climate adaptation planning, as well as provide many different webinars on different climate change topics. And they're a really good clearinghouse for other initiatives going around across the U.S. And I mentioned it in my talk also, is that it's really effective when you work within existing plans that people are already working on, rather than a standalone adaptation plan, so that it's integrated into the ongoing activities that the tribe is already working on.
Thank you. And I'm actually going to change it a little bit, the question a little bit, for Ben and for Kyle. But Kyle, I'm going to go to you first, just because you had some really great things to say about how the best research is the research that's done by tribal communities. So do you have any advice for how to get that research out into the wider world and get it listened to?
Yeah, absolutely. I think there's a couple of ways to consider getting that work out. The first way is to really engage within the tribe with artists and other media colleagues within the tribe to create vibrant reports and vibrant documentation of your health work, and then publish that in a really easy way for people to find on the tribe's website. And so I think that's one thing, and to also have a public relations strategy for doing that. A second strategy is to see if there are staff within the tribe, and it could be you individually, that have some experience or interest in academic peer review, and seeing if there is some time and capacity available to pick sort of a high quality scientific journal on climate change, like Climatic Change, or a health and environment journal, and to have a short article published on the work that you do. And so oftentimes there might be, if it's not something you're that familiar with doing, there might be somebody in an Indigenous Studies program or a trusted researcher nearby that would provide some support on how to do that. But I do think that in terms of tribal programs, that you want to make sure that there's space within your job description to be able to engage in that dissemination aspect of it, because I've traveled and engaged, I mean, literally like, probably several hundred tribes in my career on their climate change. I find that they're doing so much interesting work that would other people should know about, but they don't know about. And those tribes have no problem publishing that information, but for 1,000 reasons, they obviously haven't.
Thank you. Yeah, that's really great advice. And Ben, I saw you nodding, so I think you have something to add to that. So go ahead.
Yeah, I just think what was said by both Dr. Chief and Dr. White is absolutely agree 100%, and especially with the publication in peer review, which is admittedly a huge hurdle for many, and it's still a challenge for me. I mean, it's not easy to do these kinds of things, but in doing so, I think it adds a lot of clout to the work in terms of kind of the greater scientific community, because then it really translates that work and shows that it underwent some of this, I guess, approval by the broader community, which is not really needed, but it does help get it out there, and people will see it more. And then I think as many of us don't know it's out there otherwise, and that allows us to see it and cite it and incorporate it into our thinking, and be excited to reach out and try to further that, and to kind of follow one of Dr. White's points that I thought is really relevant here, is finding trusted scientists who can help teach and mentor students or other tribal members in the process of scientific writing, can be very helpful. And there's, speaking for myself, there's many of us, I think, who really enjoy that process of mentoring and teaching and seeing the work evolve through time and get better and very clear and concise, and communicate those pieces of information to the broader community, and get it out there and get it in the news, get it on the forefront. And then the more people that see it, the more it will get engaged and built upon. And so it's a really kind of an ongoing iterative process.
So I will synthesize that for our listeners, that here's also your opportunity to be the advocate for your tribal community if there is an interest and desire to share information with researchers like Dr. Chief, Dr. White, with Dr. Hatchett, all these doctors, and get the tribal perspective out there. It sounds like, Carletta, you said you're looking for a postdoc. If you have a link for that, you can put that in the chat. That would be terrific to get an Indigenous person in that role. And there's so much more work to be done with our tribal communities. In the couple of minutes, we have like a minute and a half maybe left in this session if we're going to keep on time. But I wonder if you just have a brief reaction to the Biden administration's very public push to include tribal ecological knowledge in all aspects of agency planning. Are you cynical like me, or do you think this is a good thing?
Well, the issue is that the people that wrote that policy, and I don't mean to sound cynical, but clearly have never had to do that work before, and they don't know how much work it is, and so the policy, when it is translated into practice, needs to furnish that capacity for tribes internally to be able to do that work, to have the staffing, the support, to be able to orchestrate a process of coming together collectively around their knowledge base. And also the policy needs to be sensitive to all the different issues that come up, right? When agencies say, oh, I respect traditional knowledge, but they have a very specific definition of what they think traditional knowledge is. And so anyways.
Yeah, I mean, I'm excited about, I'm excited that it was, that it was released, but at the same token that some concerns and worries that the traditional knowledge will begin to not be protected. Like there might be some incidences where that might be some ethical violations. So I think in that sense, I think the tribes need to lead that initiatives rather than, other researchers and outside entities coming in to lead that or to try to reach out, because I'm worried that people who have never worked with tribes, have never even read these guidelines, that they'll start to just really be a rush towards working with tribes on this. And I agree with Kyle that the tribes need to be supported in being able to, for them to just do this type of work in terms of integrating the knowledge systems, but that they need to lead it.
Yeah, I 100% agree. And thank you. That's a perfect way for us to end this session. Thank you all so much for your knowledge and sharing. Please feel free to stick around for the rest of today. We'd love to have you. And everybody else, we're going to take a break until we start our data session, which is going to be at 11:10. So this is your coffee and potty break, and we'll see you back here at 11:10. Thank you again to our panelists.